Welcome to SolarWorks for Illinois. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today we are breaking down developing solar in Illinois. My dear guest is Jonathan Roberts, Vice President at Soltage. And before I introduce Jonathan, I'm just going to make a few announcements. As I was telling the group, we do this on a monthly basis, and we record all of these events if possible. So you can find those recordings on our website at seco.com/solar webinar. And then you can also find them on YouTube. And I wanted to let everybody know we've got a couple of great events coming up in addition to today's program. On October 28th, Rob Davis, a colleague of ours from Minnesota, he is a director at Fresh Energy, is going to talk about pollinator and wildlife friendly solar farms with me in a live interview. And then in November, we have Harry Benson from Standard Solar coming on the show, November 19th. And we're going to talk about solar project finance, getting your project acquired and built. So again, check all those out at seco.com/solar webinar. Also, I'm really excited that we have launched an initiative here at Continental with some colleagues from the landscape engineering and architecture industries. And this initiative is called the Pollinator and Wildlife Friendly Solar Farm Working Group. We have been meeting bi-monthly for the last 6 months or so, and we're now trying to get the word out to a broader audience, especially to solar developers. So if you were developing solar and you want to make it pollinator friendly, please join the working group. It's great if you have Midwest experience, but it's not at all required. Most of the events are virtual, just conference calls. We will have a face-to-face meeting, hopefully, because our next meeting overlaps with Solar Power Midwest on November 14th. So I will have a room at the Palmer House Hilton, which is co-located with Solar Power Midwest, and we'll meet at 1:30 on November 14th in Chicago. And then in the next couple meeting dates are January 9th and March 12th in 2020. And you can find all of these events and you can sign up for email updates at seco.com/pollinators. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guest today, Jonathan Roberts, Vice President Midwest for Soltage. He leads project development and business development for Soltage here in the Midwest. He has over 10 years of experience in utilities and solar. So it's great to have somebody with so much breadth and depth of experience. And he has worked on over 80 megawatts of projects in 7 states, including C&I solar, community solar, and utility scale solar. Prior to Soltage, he was a senior project manager at SoCore Energy, now NG Solar, where he worked to deploy solar across the US. Jonathan has a BS in industrial engineering and an MBA, both from Iowa State University. And he is a NABCEP certified solar PV installation professional. For all of the professionals out there who are thinking of getting into solar or wanting to get into solar, check out NABCEP. That is the gold standard in solar credentials. Welcome to the show, Jonathan. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here.
And it's been good getting to know you for the last couple of years. Soltage was certainly one of the developers that we met early in 2017. And now you have been through almost a full life cycle, right, of getting some projects through the pipeline, and now with a REC award. And I thought we'd start off by just having you give us the high level, what has that experience been so far, being an early adopter in the Illinois community solar market?
It's been a challenge, but it's also been a market that I think a lot of interesting indicators and references in media have indicated that, you know, amongst the states in the Midwest of what market's heating up right now, I think you can read a lot in the standard industry publications and see and hear at conferences that are pertaining to solar that Illinois is definitely top of mind for most developers that are looking at the Midwest at the moment, outside of the more traditional markets on the coasts.
Yes, so most of the developers working in Illinois are not indigenous, other than really a very small handful. And so companies are coming from Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, the Carolinas, maybe Delaware, and then, of course, Colorado and California, and a little bit from Minnesota as well. Minnesota was the first state in the Midwest to really pop. They've got, what, around 1,200 megawatts now. And thanks to FEJA, we're adding 3,000 megawatts of solar in the next couple of years. From a community solar perspective, the IPA, the Illinois Power Agency, has awarded RECs to 100 community solar projects. That's 200 megawatts AC, right?
Yes.
Of solar. And so what's the status of your work in Illinois and the spectrum of your priorities?
Illinois, I think, caught a lot of attention for good reasons. I moved to the state of Illinois. I'm based in Chicago typically. I'm in Jersey City today at the Soltage headquarters for this call for a monthly meeting that we have out here. But in terms of Illinois and Chicago has been, I would say, kind of an incubator in the Midwest for a variety of solar companies and energy companies and wind companies and electrical service providers and installers such as Continental. When I first moved to Illinois working in solar for my prior employer, I would go elsewhere to kind of following various state programs. And there's two kind of things that are driving a lot of the especially community solar activity across the country. And one thing is state legislatures making decisions and passing legislation to call for more renewables. And then another indicator that is being observed and heard by the solar community looking to develop and create projects would be IRPs by investor-owned utilities that are looking to come up with their long-term or at least 5-year outlooks on what they're going to do to continue to provide their services and maintain grid stability and reliability. And increasingly, as they look to retire assets, especially coal assets, they are looking to increase the amount of wind and solar that they have in their overall portfolio. So those two things are kind of driving a lot of the activity state by state. I myself worked quite a bit in the Minnesota market, which I think before Illinois was one of the great Midwestern markets to be working on larger community solar projects. And there were a variety of things that made it work. And there were a variety of things that incentivized folks to come in and build great projects. That perhaps has peaked, and now some of the rules pertaining to developing new projects that are looking to go to Minnesota, it's not as favorable as it once was. Projects now are limited, I believe, to 1 megawatt AC. I think at the peak of the program, they were up to 5 megawatt. But now in Illinois, with the Future Energy Jobs Act, obviously there is a very robust piece of legislation that was backed by the previous administration and continues to be looked after by the new governor, and the legislature are looking to the IPA and the ICC to enforce the program. And so far we're seeing good things in terms of some of the first projects are actually going to come to fruition. Now, what we all would like to see is it to continue for the long term, and there are some concerns about funding shortfalls in 2020 and beyond. But there are different methods being proposed to address that, such as legislation that we might be able to talk to later, as well as the IPA is revising per their guidance of FEJA, the Future Energy Jobs Act, asks the IPA to revisit their what's called the Long-Term Renewable Resources Procurement Plan. And that is currently under revision, with comments being accepted by the public as well as the industry, who are very carefully reviewing that.
Yes, it's fairly deep water. I will say, having drank from the fire hose now for the last couple of years. And while FEJA is an amazing piece of legislation, and it basically is fueling wind and solar with $200 million a year in incentives that are paid out in the form of RECs to project owners. RECs are renewable energy credits. 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated by a renewable asset is 1 REC. And that really works. The RECs that were put on the market were perhaps a little overpriced, and so you saw 800 projects in initial development and interconnection process. Only 100 of those were awarded RECs in the lottery. They went to lottery because the project number was so high. That lottery was not popular because it basically didn't reward the earliest adopters or developers that were getting projects off the ground before anyone else. And so, but being a developer in Illinois is definitely not for the faint of heart, but it is lucrative if you succeed, right?
Yes, I would say that for the projects that were awarded through the process, especially for the adjustable block program for community solar projects, it was a rewarding project for those that came out with REC contracts. We did come out with a REC contract from that process, and some companies were able to come out with quite a few REC contracts in that process. And I guess you have to keep in mind the different species of solar companies that are out there. My company, Soltage, we not only would develop a project, but we would also own and operate it long term. There are also companies that come in and really focus on the development and then kind of flip the project over to another investor and exit the equation down the road. There's a lot of different intermediary types of companies in between, but so at the moment, what's happening is everybody's kind of coming up with their game plans and working with ComEd and Ameren through the details of their revised interconnection combined studies, and finding out which EPC partners are available, and trying to work within the myriad of programs and state laws that exist in Illinois for full compliance, as only approved vendors could be recipients of the REC contracts, and the approved vendors must use licensed DG installers like Continental Electric to perform the work in Illinois. So now our work is before us to actually get these projects online and working and fully subscribed, as Illinois, for the community solar projects, chose to more heavily incentivize, you mentioned high incentive levels, for small subscribers for the community solar projects. So not big corporate off-takers, but they really wanted these projects to be participated in by small businesses and residences across Illinois.
So that is a double edge, right? That in the law, in the Future Energy Jobs Act, it was explicit that all of Illinois should benefit, whether or not you have a sunny roof, whether or not you're high or low income. And so there were special incentives to engage residents and low income residents in community solar. But at the end of the day, there's only so many RECs to go around, right? And so we now have these 100 projects. This is the first wave. Hopefully we will get more funding. That's a little bit of a question mark, and we can talk about the path to 100 and the importance of additional legislation to bolster FEJA. But walk us through, if you would, the life cycle of a community solar project.
I guess in terms of development in Illinois, part of it was kind of getting an understanding of what the ground rules were from the IPA and from the state law. And there was a process of kind of monitoring as they came out with their program guidebook and the long-term renewable resources procurement plan, just trying to understand what would the qualifications be for a developer seeking to enter a project. And at a high level, just for kind of quick conversational purposes, you needed 3 things to submit a project in Illinois. One was interconnection. You needed an interconnection service agreement. So going kind of from cradle to the finish line on the whole interconnection process with either ComEd, Ameren, or even I think Mid-American had a small amount of territory that was included in FIJA, and community projects located in the territories of municipal utilities and cooperative utilities were also technically allowed. So getting that interconnection was one of the key legs of the chair. The second would be site control, either through having a lease or an option to lease a site. And so a variety of companies went out to meet with landowners. And of course, we're just speaking about community solar projects out here in the countryside, usually on agricultural land. Sometimes not, but a majority of the time. There's also, of course, a very robust pool of applicants for commercial and industrial rooftop projects, and that did not go to lottery, and a lot of the folks that entered projects like that were very successful in getting good projects through. But back to the third item. So first is the interconnection, second is the site control, and the third was the non-ministerial permits. So essentially at a high level, county approval to build your project where you intend to build it on the land that's typically owned by a third-party landowner that you have an agreement to lease with. And so all the developers go through that process, got those items ready, a variety of other checks and balances, dotting our I's, crossing our T's, kind of work goes into it to make sure everything's ready and packaged up. For us, for seeking investors, or if we have investors already like we do, just making sure you have all the due diligence items that would come, that's a longer conversation. And then submitting the project to the IPA, to the program administrator, who is Incline, and then having Incline review the projects for completeness. And then, as you mentioned earlier, it was way oversubscribed, 10 to 1, and they elected an option to commit to a lottery. The lottery was held, and now everybody's in a state of taking those contracts, fulfilling obligations to ComEd for interconnection deposits, collateral payments to for the REC contracts in the amount of 5% of the total REC collateral, and 5% of the REC contract, which gets paid out over a 5-year period. So that was another incentive that brought people beyond just the high REC levels. It was also that they get paid out very quickly, which on the one hand was good for creating a very large influx of interest in Illinois for the solar community, but perhaps a challenge on the REC allocation being paid out too quickly to the point where in 2020 there might not be sufficient funding. And that's something that we'll get to later when we talked about legislative fixes. But after that, it's up to the respective REC contract holders to get these things built, working with EPC firms and good firms like Continental Electric and a variety of the other actors that are out there working to get these things built and operational and working and online safely and efficiently, getting them interconnected and getting the appropriate approvals to get the systems online and delivering electrons to the grid.
I think it would be safe to say that site control was probably the easiest of those 3. Would you agree?
Yes, but I would say that especially given the environment that came about after there was a lot of attention on Illinois from the nationwide solar community, I think that brought a lot of companies that maybe not even solar companies, just kind of land leasing agents or folks that their specialty is just kind of siting these sites and getting documents signed. And so with that influx of attention, it created a situation, I'd say, where landowners were getting competing offers, and it really increased the price of per acre that people were willing to settle on to build the project. So maybe it's the easiest of those 3 items, maybe the shortest lead time, but there there are some nuances that go into, you know, negotiating with the landowner on how and where to site an array and what conditions they'll agree to. And if they won't agree to reasonable economic conditions, if you're someone that owns and operates a site, it can be challenging to get an agreement that will work into your own individual financial model for a company.
I think it's frustrating for landowners and facility owners to truly understand the plethora of opportunities that Illinois presents. We have abundant land resources, and so getting those 800 sites, it was a lot of work. I'm not trying to minimize that, but when you think about that compared to the interconnection and the cost of interconnection, which, you know, turned out to be many surprises. I think especially in PJM in Northern Illinois and ComEd territory. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I'd say in terms of prices to apply and the various steps of the process that's called forth in the state law, I think it's Part 466 that deals with interconnection for ComEd and Ameren. That was all pretty reasonable and well understood in terms of following the process for your pre-application, then your application, and then a facility study and a system impact study, and then finally getting to an interconnection service agreement. But along the way, there were some speed bumps or challenges to overcome as many projects applied. It created kind of an oversupply of applications, and ComEd was under a requirement by the law to treat every application as equally viable, and Ameren as well. And I think over time, what we that are trying to get these projects under interconnection service agreements, we started to notice that, especially like you said, in the PJM northern part of the state, we started to see higher interconnection costs relative to what we see in other markets. And I've built projects in about 7 states so far, and I think the highest that I've seen so far has been in Illinois. And I think some of that is a learning curve that the utilities might be getting over as they try to evaluate what and how and where to interconnect these systems in the best way possible that maintains their reliability and service to their clientele.
And then on the non-ministerial permit side, every jurisdiction in Illinois is a little different. Some counties have more solar-friendly ordinances. Some had no ordinances. Many places didn't have ordinances. So that was a whole, and that continues to this day. But what was that experience for Soltage?
Yeah, I would see a lot of my contemporaries and other companies would be at these meetings, and we would be representing our projects, and it varied from county to county. Like you mentioned, some had robust processes in place. They had solar ordinances. Some had worked with there's a Sunshot initiative, I think, called Soul Smart Communities, and they had adopted draft ordinance language that I think was well crafted. I think Vote Solar was involved in that process, and I think there's like some counties, like Will County, for instance, was one that participated in that, and Kane County. So counties had different approaches. I think some were a bit more savvy in terms of like trying to look for best practices, and maybe even looking at Minnesota and looking what people did there. And as you mentioned, some places didn't have any processes. And so it was up to the solar community and legal counsel to, you know, work with the IPA and their program administrator and trying to figure out what would be required to be submitted in those examples. And that might have created some conditions for certain places to perhaps have an easier path to submitting projects if they didn't have as robust county non-ministerial requirements. So that was something that maybe perhaps contributed to some of the higher numbers, was kind of a low bar of entry in certain areas of the rules.
Right. So now there are these 100 projects. They've been awarded RECs. the clock is ticking. They have 18 months at face value to get these projects energized. The developers are now either selling their projects or proceeding to find an EPC and or EPC them themselves, right, and get them built. How is that going, or what is your perception of that process so far?
I can't really see into the inner workings of all 100 projects, but I do know, I think there's going to be maybe some constraint of labor in the market. Perhaps just in terms of like the amount of systems, we threw out some numbers at the beginning of the broadcast, but I think, you know, we're looking at something on the order of like 666 megawatt AC total, I think, of projects that have to get built in that 18-month time frame, roughly. There's some different nuances. And for the community solar, that's it's quite a bit. You've got 100 projects times 2 megawatt AC a piece, 200 megawatts just the community solar projects, and that's a lot of projects all up and down the state by a lot of different companies. Some having large portfolios, some having small. We're looking to buy some projects of folks that have no intentions of owning and operating long term. That's something that we're looking at to augment our portfolio, and others are probably doing the same. Some are looking to sell what they had incentivized. So it will be a challenge, and it looks like everybody's cautiously and carefully moving forward, kind of going through the appropriate next steps with, they signed their REC contract and then going on to paying deposits with ComEd and Ameren, and executing on amendments to your interconnection service agreement, agreeing to construction schedules. And in a lot of cases, the people that are selling projects, there's a hefty due diligence process that they will have to go through to the individuals that are buying their projects to get those transactions closed. So you might see kind of a waterfall or cascading of project start times. And then not to mention the investment tax credit at the moment is at 30% in 2019, and that will start scaling down. I believe it goes to 26% next year in 2020. And so a lot of projects are looking to IRS guidelines on recommendations for what's called safe harboring. And that will be another, I would say, big driver in terms of outlining what next steps are for construction timelines, of kind of figuring out, okay, we got to get our materials, we got to get modules and the racking and the inverters, as well as all the other balance of system requirements. And modules right now are tricky given the last full year of the ITC. You're seeing a lot of firms that are selling out of their stocks. You're seeing impacts from the trade tariffs that impact solar modules. And so there's a lot of considerations going into play to kind of moving towards getting boots on the ground to get some of these systems built.
Yep, a lot of moving parts, and that clock is ticking. You know, at face value, given the awards happened in May, you know, that says by November, December 2020, all of those projects have to be energized. Now, I think you can apply for a 6-month extension, if I'm correct. Is that right?
There are options for extensions, yes. So and especially if it's on like an external fault of, say, the investor-owned utility that you're interconnecting with, I believe there's some definite provisions that the IPA allows for those extensions in those circumstances.
So the challenges are many, but you're taking your lumps and slogging through. Apparently the fact that you only won one project in the lottery did not dissuade you. And part of that is your business model, right? Which you are a long-term owner operator. And so it fits quite well for you to acquire other developers' projects.
Yes.
And there are many developers that don't want to be long-term owners. And so there is a lot of acquisition going on right now, and there's probably more to come.
Yes, we're very committed to the Illinois market, very interested in finding partners to work with, whether it's through acquisitions or also just building the portfolio that we are putting together at the moment, which will be an interesting exercise as we close out 2019 and go into 2020, along with everyone else doing the same thing. And as a long-term owner and operator, we own projects in about 14 states, and Illinois will be number 15. And we're looking forward to kind of the steps needed to make that happen.
What about, let's just fast forward to complete the cycle, the life cycle of these community solar projects. As they're getting constructed, then you're also looking for off-takers or subscribers, as we call them in community solar. How do you go about finding subscribers?
Part of that, I would say, is up to each company going onto their own strategies. In the Illinois market, it's a deregulated market, so there's a lot of competition and different options for consumers that are looking to source electricity. I am a ComEd customer from where I live in Chicago. And although ComEd, often owns the assets, the poles, the wires that deliver my power in the state of Illinois, I can select a different electricity supplier. And so it's kind of a similar thing for solar projects. ComEd might be the counterparty that's buying the REC and people are getting credits on their bills, but they can choose different electricity suppliers as intermediaries. And so that's probably what you'll see in Illinois, is people trying to do their homework on how do you do business in Illinois if you are selling electrons on the grid, and finding kind of a path through navigating what I would say is perhaps more complex than other states, but also is competitive. So a lot of people are going to be trying to, evaluate that framework in the state of Illinois and finding a path.
And I think that the IPA is going to put information on Illinois Shines about how to, if you're interested in subscribing to a community solar project, how to find those projects. So
yes.
Just go to Illinois Shines and you'll find resources there to get connected to a project. Honestly, I think that the subscriptions will go fairly quickly. We're not talking about a huge percentage of, if it was all residential, I don't know what the head count is, but it's not a huge percentage of the population by any stretch.
Right, and the maximum incentive is up to 75% small subscribers, so there could be possibility of that other 25% being a larger subscriber. But yeah, there's different rules to kind of jump through and figure out a right combination of residential to small commercial, and how is that defined by the IPA and things of that nature.
Yep. So stepping back for a sec, let's talk about risks, rewards again, and then let's spend a little time on the future, because that is so important for developers and other stakeholders to get engaged in the legislative initiatives underway. But when you think back to your experience in Minnesota and Soltage's experience in other places, and put that in context for us, how good, bad, or ugly are things going in Illinois, given that it is a greenfield?
There are a variety of ways to kind of approach that. I do think in Minnesota, we saw a successful execution to get a large amount of solar deployed, and successfully, and in a fashion that leaves us with operating systems to this day. And you threw out a number earlier that was in the gigawatts, and year by year it was something on the order of like half a gigawatt a year of completed projects. So it was a substantial success story nationwide. And then I think over time the program was perhaps set up to not maintain that trajectory indefinitely, but to kind of taper off. And so sometimes we in the solar industry look at that as kind of a boom and bust cycle. And for those of us that are engaging in Illinois, we really like what we see in the Future Energy Jobs Act and, what is now a state law of having 25% renewables by 2025. And we're on board with that. And we're here to work and do business in the state. But we don't want to see a boom and bust cycle that we've seen in other Midwest markets. And so the proof is going to be in the pudding of either figuring out fixes to the existing law and program through, like, I know the IPA is revising their long-term renewable resource procurement plan, and we could talk about some of the bullet points they're going through there. And then another option would be a legislative fix, and you mentioned Path to 100 is one that I would say almost the entirety of the wind and solar industry are fully behind, trying to advocate to fix what didn't work, enhance things to make them better and more efficient. And also, I think, to be bolder. The Path to 100 commits, I believe, to 40% by 2040. So loftier goals to try and get us where we need to be, because I think at the end of the day, there's an economic part to this, but there's also a part of trying to do our part to limit carbon emissions and to do something about climate change.
Indeed. So let's talk about that, though. The long-term renewable resource plan. What changes do you see coming down the pike that you're excited about?
Okay, so I guess a few of the things that we've seen like kind of an updated analysis of RPS budgets, and that kind of led to concerns, about the targets and goals, looking that there are targets and goals, but we might not hit those, as well as the funding constraints. And that's been publicly announced by even the director of the IPA on public television, as well as in print media. There's also some revisions on alternative compliance payments. There's approaches to potential competitive utility scale procurements that would address contingency needs and adding structure for new utility scale wind and solar procurements if there's funding. Another item has been a process for updating the adjustable block program contracts. Right now, they're a bit rigid, and there are some hopes of being able to go through an understood process to make changes. Also, very importantly, a framework on how to manage the current wait list for community solar projects in the adjustable block program. As we mentioned earlier, 10% of the projects got selected. Another 90% were kind of sidelined and waitlisted. Those are projects that have site control. They did have interconnection, and they did have non-ministerial permits. So a lot of investment has been made by companies, and I think a lot of folks would like to see some type of a fix in the plan from the IPA, if not in legislature, that perhaps incentivizes or prioritizes those projects that submitted in 2019, maybe get an enhanced option for 2020. So that's just a few things. Just codifying consumer protection requirements a little bit better, and maybe an approach to looking at the prioritization of the low-income solar projects and clarified eligibility for nonprofit and public facilities. We haven't talked a lot about Solar for All, but that was another program under FEJA that it seemed very popular, but it didn't have a lot of funding. So those are kind of some of the things we're looking at. I think the biggest thing is, what are we going to do about the waitlisted projects for community solar? And also, what is going to happen in terms of having funding to keep the train moving forward in 2020.
So on both of those fronts, what do you tell a developer who has a wait list of projects? What do you think the odds are that those projects will get off the ground?
Right now, I mean, to be brutally honest, the odds aren't very favorable. I would say we're still waiting to see how the rules change and if that impacts those odds. As the IPA revisits that plan, they could change how the wait list is handled. That's something that's very much TBD. So it's definitely worth the time, effort, money, attention, I would say, for a developer to find, when do your permits expire? Is there a process for an extension? are your lease options going to expire? Things like that, that you can control to maybe extend the viability of some of the things that you as a developer have worked hard to implement.
Yeah, and so moving forward, we do need additional funding. Right now, the assessment is that the current allotment of funding is going to get us to 17% RPS. The goal is 25% by 2025. One of the pieces that the solar industry is hoping for is the path to 100. What are your thoughts about the path to 100?
I think the path to 100, amongst the various pieces of legislation that have been put forth to try to build off the success of the Future Energy Jobs Act and take us forward, I think the path to 100 is the fix. Now, I know that from perhaps at a legislative level, from Congress and the Senate at the state level, as well as the governor's office, I think they want to see all the different pieces of legislation and the folks backing them to come together and come up with a compromise. And so that, I think, is going to be very important. I have been down in Springfield meeting with my representatives as a constituent to advocate for Path to 100, but I do think in terms of getting something that the governor can sign, I think best case we'll see something maybe in the veto session, but more realistically, we might need to see more of a coalition of folks getting together to resolve differences and create something that can be supported by all the different parties.
Yep. Very much want to see the Path to 100 succeed. You can go to path to100.com, I believe, and learn more about that. Sign up for updates, send letters to your legislators, and many other things. There's a huge amount of resources there at the Path to 100 website, as well as ISEA, the Illinois Solar Energy Association website, so check that out. So to all of the listeners and participants, please do chat questions. That we've had a few questions which I think we've answered about the lottery, and but chat your questions in or raise your hand. Art Spooner, you raised your hand. I could try to unmute you. Art, you are unmuted.
Yeah, that was a false button. I'm sorry, it was a pocket dial.
Okay, no worries. So while people are thinking of questions, we're going to wrap up here in the next 5-10 minutes. But Jonathan, what is driving community solar regionally, in your opinion?
In the state of Illinois?
Yeah, so you mentioned at the outset that there are two different approaches. One is legislative, which we have with FEJA in Illinois, and then you have states like Minnesota and Michigan with IRPs, independent resource plans. I don't know that Michigan is getting community solar per se. They're going to get, I think, more utility scale solar. But yeah, let's put Illinois in context. And who are our closest brethren when it comes to community solar?
I mean, I think every state kind of puts their own fingerprint on this process, and maybe everyone's trying to figure out what works in a local context. And I think that's what happened in Illinois, is you have to look at your local requirements in terms of the type of market you're in and come up with a solution that works. You know, that's kind of the story of our country, of state by state having a policy that works at a state level. You don't really see too much of a federal FERC-based, but we could go on a tangent about various independent service operators and their relationship with FERC, but that'd be a longer conversation. But I think in the state of Illinois, we're seeing the beginning of something very positive that I think is, as the market and as consumers and as authorities like the IPA are trying to work together to come up with something that can take us where we all want to go, to implement the law of the Future Energy Jobs Act. And so we're all trying to get there together, I think.
One of the challenges that we face as an installer is labor shortages. You know, these are projects that do require highly skilled and trained labor force. Illinois being the greenfield that it is, before we got FEJA, we had on the order of 200 megawatts of solar in Illinois. Now we're adding 3,000 megawatts. So there is a need for more people to get into the industry. Tim asked the question, you know, future career directions and paths. I have regular conversations with various and sundry professionals who are looking at the rise of solar in Illinois and the Midwest and wondering how they can get into it. And it just depends on your expertise. Obviously, there's opportunities across the spectrum, from electricians and installers and laborers to engineers and project managers and business developers and finance professionals. So really the entire sector is adding people pretty much as fast as it can. And there are limits. And so there will be an influx of labor from out of state as well. And that's just as well, because some of those people might stay and become residents of the state of Illinois. Illinois is losing population. And
Sure.
You know, the renewables industry can stem that tide and become a growth market. So any concerns about labor force in your mind, Jonathan?
I think there will be constraints as we work to develop a labor force internally. And as you mentioned, a lot of firms will look to neighboring states, maybe that people that are veterans of other programs, like from the teams that built the projects in Minnesota. I think a lot of those firms might work in Illinois. In Illinois, you've got the IBEW, which will probably be working quite a bit. This will be a boon to anyone that's an electrician. I myself moved to the state of Illinois about 5 years ago, and my career thus far has been various levels of the utility industry. But I would say that, you know, FEJA definitely put a shot of adrenaline into the system of getting a robust economy for future career paths and directions for folks that are interested in working with utilities, working with solar, working with wind, and trying to build this new infrastructure that I would argue ardently that we need.
What does it take to be a good developer in your
you'd have to ask a good developer, but I think that there's got to let stuff wash over you, and persistence and being tenacious. I think a technical background helps. Also, a passion for solar, I think, is key. I think also when you're going out, especially on community solar projects and meeting with local communities, it's very important to have empathy in hearing concerns and trying to address concerns of individuals of where you're proposing to build these projects. I definitely think that goes into it as well.
We're going to wrap up here, and I want to make a few announcements for anybody who didn't catch those at the beginning. We do this every month, and in October, we're going to have Rob Davis on the show from Fresh Energy, talking about pollinator and wildlife-friendly solar farms, a very important topic as we see thousands of acres being converted from either farmland or fallow land or other uses to solar farms. And we want to make that as environmentally sound and friendly to pollinators like bees and butterflies and wildlife like birds and insects. And then Harry Benson is coming on in November to talk about solar project finance, getting your project acquired and built. You can find all of these and how to register at seco.com/solar webinar. And with that, I want to thank our guest, Jonathan Roberts of Soltage. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Have a great day.